Very happy to be with all of you. It's a tremendous honor. Director General, thank you very much for this invitation. When Ambassador Perez called me to see if I would do this, I was wondering what could I talk about as a retired Foreign Service officer. I could talk about when I wake up in the morning, when I get out of my pajamas, what I put in my coffee, do I watch The View? But this is my first Foreign Affairs Day as a retired FSO. So now I'm part of what Nicholas Platt calls the Gujarati.
Oh no.
And I wear that with pride. In fact, I'm a card-carrying member. I'm sure some of you have seen these cards. They allow you to go through the visitor entrance, to be examined by diplomatic security, and to eat in the cafeteria, but to be apprehended if you stray beyond the first floor. So anyway, what a pleasure. Thank you very, very much. And what a pleasure to be here in the Franklin room. This room bookended my career. I was sworn in here in April of 1984, and I retired here in June of 2018, thanks to the generosity of Secretary Pompeo. When I was sworn in, this room didn't look anything like this. I'm sure many of you remember that. It was done up in a 1950s Federalist style, which some have referred to as Motel Moderne. Or Mussolini's penthouse. But what's happened to it is quite remarkable. And actually, this suite of rooms is my favorite part of the department, simply because such a tremendous job has been done here by our curators over time. And in case you don't know it, you are in and around probably the most extensive collection of American decorative arts in the United States.
Yeah.
So be careful where you put your drink, and be careful what you lean against, because it's probably worth several hundred thousands of dollars. But for me, what's always been remarkable about this floor and parts of the 7th floor, especially the Secretary's office, is that when the department thought about redoing these rooms, they decided to choose a period of time from about 1795 to 1825. That surprisingly does not represent the apex of American power. In fact, quite the contrary, it represents a period of time in which we were a struggling group of colonies turned into states, all looking westward, all fearful of the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Russians, you name it. Just about every empire on earth was around us and licking its lips or its chops, wondering when they were going to be able to get a piece of us. And yet, at this time, through things like American decorative arts, Americans began to define themselves as Americans. They began to show a sense of self and a self-consciousness in how they presented themselves to each other and to the world. And it was also a time in which the United States had to live by its wits, which means it had to live by diplomacy. And so I love it. I love coming up here and seeing this incredible collection. I love seeing the important documents that are in the next room over. And I love being reminded by the fact that even though we were relatively small and vulnerable and exposed, we had great self-confidence. I mean, look at that painting of Ben Franklin. This is a man who's about to go out to Paris. He's going to try to keep the French in the war on our side. He's going to try to keep the Spanish in the war on our side. He needs weapons, he needs funding, and yet he's calm, almost tranquil. I can only assume that he knows that he does not require a security clearance, and he does not have to be confirmed by the United States Senate. In fact, John Kerry once famously said that he would not have been confirmed by the United States Senate. The reasons we're all familiar with. As I thought about what to say here, I knew fearfully that I would speak after Bill Brownfield. And there is little I can add to what Bill said, because the fundamental point of his discourse was to say that this is a profession that's valuable. This is a profession that has meaning. And it has meaning not only to us, but to also those who come next, and those who are already continuing this profession. And it has profound meaning for the United States of America. If I could just put a parenthesis in here, the Director General talked about the work that Bill did in Colombia, which was impressive and important, and talked about his role in what the Colombians called Operation Jaque, or Operation Checkmate, which was the hostage rescue operation. And I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the time. And I can tell you that this was a tough operation, and one that would not have succeeded without Bill's intervention. As the Director General noted, there had been a group of Americans captured following a crash of an aircraft, State Department contractors, with 4 gentlemen, heroic gentlemen, with a Colombian co-pilot. The FARC executed the Colombian co-pilot, then executed the American pilot when he attempted to come to the aid of the Colombian, and then took 3 Americans hostage and held them for years. We, on numerous occasions, attempted to rescue them, and on one occasion in particular had put a special forces group on the ground with Colombian special forces to track the hostages over time. And they actually found the hostages, and at one point the Colombian special forces had eyes on the hostages, but because of the way they were operating, the American special forces were not with the Colombians at that time. And when the Colombians reported that the Americans were bathing in the river distant from the FARC camp, and should they go in and grab them, we said no, because we didn't have our guys with them. The Colombians were so upset at us that we didn't trust them. So upset at us that they didn't think we could actually pull our guys out, that when they began a follow-on operation related to the hostages, they didn't tell us until we found out through the hard work of Bill and his embassy. But then it was a question of convincing Washington that this was a viable operation, that this could actually work. And I won't go into the details, but it was far-fetched. But at the same time, it was important that we let the Colombians do it, because our relationship with the Colombians really hung in the balance. Our relationship with the Colombian armed forces, with their intelligence services, and with the president of Colombia at the time. And I can remember being in the Situation Room with then Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte, arguing with the senior leadership of DoD, of our intelligence community, the Vice President's office, the National Security Advisor at the time, about what we could expect of the Colombians and what we needed to do. And it was really Bill's intervention and his insistence that this was actually an operation that was already working, that was already in play, and that was going to deliver the hostages in the way that we expected it to be delivered, that carried the day. So there are 3 Americans who have been liberated, largely because of the hard work of Bill and his embassy and the relationship that he built with the Colombians, and it's something that I'm very admiring of. But as Bill noted, to be an American diplomat is a high calling. It's a noble calling. He and I had just had a discussion about whether it's the first or the second profession. I won't go into that. But one of my favorite secretaries of state, Elihu Root, who was Teddy Roosevelt's Secretary of State, and the first Secretary of State. I did, actually. In case you haven't noticed, Bill is taller and younger than I am. Aside from being Teddy Roosevelt's Secretary of State, excuse me while I laugh. He was also the first Secretary of State to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He's He's also the first Secretary of State to travel abroad as Secretary of State, believe it or not. And Judy, you'd be pleased to know he went to Rio, so, which was appropriate at the time. But Root said that the purpose of diplomacy is to rescue from the field of difference and controversy and transfer to the field of common understanding and agreement one subject after another. In other words, diplomacy is a cumulative process that requires constant engagement, patience, and an ability to forge accommodation by understanding our primary interests and those of our allies and our adversaries. It is an empathetic act, but it is a difficult art. Former Secretary Henry Stimson, speaking at a memorial service for Root, said, "Joint human endeavor is the most difficult task of men, and international cooperation is the most difficult form of joint human endeavor." Stimson continued by noting that diplomacy is not an affair of abstract theory, but of human habits of restraint, human poise, and precedents based upon human action. Put simply, diplomacy is an everyday affair that depends on the character and the purpose of the diplomat, and the leaders and peoples the diplomat represents. Root himself had great hope in the capacity of democracy to change the nature of diplomacy and international affairs. Writing near the end of World War I, he said that the development of democracy was the great fact under which the effort to reinstate the law of nations is to be made. Unlike the empires that had pitched the world into global conflict, Root noted that democracies are incapable of holding or enhancing these sinister policies of ambition, which are beyond the reach of argument and the control of law. He wrote that democracy has destroyed that form of government which had shown itself incapable of respecting law and justice. Some would argue that Root's optimism was premature, and subsequent global events would show that to be true. But he was not wrong about American democracy. Nor was he wrong about the diplomacy that it informed, shaped, and directed. When the United States finally emerged from its isolationism following World War II, it did so by building alliances, institutions, and practices of collective security, and organizations of economic and commercial development that were dedicated to preserving the peace and promoting prosperity and human well-being. And the United States was successful in this endeavor in spite of facing a terrible and implacable adversary. Our success in the remarkable global transformation that it unleashed was the product of American diplomacy as the vehicle and expression of American will and power. Our accomplishments, which can rightfully be claimed by many in this room, will be remarked upon with admiration and respect by generations to come. However, as Root noted in 1917, it is a mistake to underestimate the transformative impact of the forces of change. He said, "No human laws or conventions can bind the forces which work through the centuries." It is worth remembering that important point, because we once again are living through a period of upheaval. In fact, I would argue that we are living through a period of eclipse and rebirth of American foreign policy and diplomacy, as dramatic as that following World War II. The major difference, however, is that the changes following World War II were the product of a cataclysm. The changes we are experiencing today are the product of success. They are the product of ending global ideological conflict. They are the product of building a world economy. They are the product of facilitating the rise and reemergence of giant societies and economies like India, and China into international life. They are the product of promoting the independence and democratization of Africa and Latin America. They are the product of keeping the peace. For some, this period is an anxious time. They comfort themselves with nostalgia and long to return to another time. I, however, believe that looking backwards at this time only wins one the fate of Lot's wife. You get turned into a pillar of salt.
Yep.
Which does not mean we should not memorialize our accomplishments or draw from them meaningful lessons. We should. But our principal purpose should be to encourage the American diplomats who will rebuild our foreign policy and who will do so in a difficult, if not toxic, political environment.
Yeah.
During the 5 years I served as counselor of the department and undersecretary of state, I had the opportunity to travel to many of our diplomatic missions and meet the young officers who are the future of our diplomacy. Within the department, I also met with the Foreign Service officers and civil servants who worked in the engine room of American foreign policy. They are remarkable. They are remarkable for their intelligence, for their courage, for their experience, for their determination. They are also young, and they are evidence that the State Department is in the midst of a huge generational change. The number has slid over time. In my day, the number was 60% of the Foreign Service that had been in for 10 years or less. I've heard the director use the term 50%. But whatever number you use, guys like me are at the far right end of the table and get pushed off. But there's a huge hunk of officers who are staying. If they can be convinced to make a career of diplomacy, they will be a source of stability and continuity during a time of upheaval in the United States and in the world. But for this to happen, they must be encouraged. They must be told that bad times are nothing new.
Yeah.
In fact, we've had worse. Anyone doubting this should read chapter 18 of Chip Boland's book, Witness to History. It describes his disagreements with then Secretary John Foster Dulles, his confirmation hearings to be ambassador to Moscow after George Kennan was PNG, and the efforts of Joseph McCarthy to quash that nomination. In fact, Boland begins chapter 18 by joking that the incoming Eisenhower administration, joking about the incoming Eisenhower administration, that the new people entering the State Department reminded me of a wagon train in hostile Indian territory. Every night the wagons would be put in a circle and a guard posted. But Boland, having watched George Kennan be forced out of the department, thought he might suffer the same fate. His worries mounted when Secretary Dulles, who was scheduled to be on the Hill at the same time as he, but in different hearings, suggested that they ride in separate cars and not be photographed together. Boland wrote, "It was difficult for me to recognize the fact that I had become a symbol of the Foreign Service at bay. As the fact dawned on me, I became exhilarated. I welcomed the opportunity to defend the service. Our purpose should be to express a similar exhilaration and transfer it to our young colleagues in the department, not simply because they are American diplomats, but because they have the good fortune of being part of an effort to remake American foreign policy and diplomacy, and to redefine American purpose in the world." Speaking recently to a group of students at my alma mater, the College of William and Mary, I said that when I entered the Foreign Service in 1984, the trajectory of American power and purpose was well defined. My watchwords at that time were really duty and service. For the next generation of American diplomats, however, their watchwords would be creativity and innovation. What an extraordinary opportunity. It almost makes you want to be young again. Like Bill, my point is to say that we are here to encourage. We are here to remind people of what we experienced and to give them the strength and the faith that they need to understand that if we could face these kinds of challenges and be successful, certainly they can. But again, thank you for your patience today. Madam Director General, the thought that anybody thought I was relevant is I'm grateful for. Thank you very much.